I didn't know my life was about to split into two over a single sentence. One moment, Nathan and I were planning brunch, scrolling through Instagram, laughing at memes. The next, the foundation of everything I thought I understood about him and our relationship was crumbling. It started when I asked him to slow down on spending. Not nagging, not judgmental, just a quiet, practical request. Nathan, maybe we should track expenses for a while? I expected him to nod, maybe shrug, perhaps even argue gently, but instead he looked me straight in the eyes and said, I accept it. I accept what? I asked, confused, a chill crawling up my spine. That this is who you are, he said. His tone was calm, almost clinical, but beneath it I sensed a quiet steel. You are going to keep spending. I'm not paying for everything anymore. I accept that. Time froze for a second. The apartment suddenly silent, despite the hum of the refrigerator. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a joke, a weird social experiment, but the weight in his voice told me otherwise. For years, I had relied on him to cover the lifestyle I couldn't afford on my boutique wages, dinners, Ubers, outfits for Instagram posts, and suddenly the safety net was gone. It wasn't just about money. It was the first sign that my carefully curated online persona, my image as a stylish, fun, Instagram-worthy girl, wasn't compatible with reality. Nathan wasn't trying to control me. He was setting a boundary, and that boundary hit harder than I expected. The next morning, I realized things were about to escalate. The brunch I had planned, the weekend plans, even casual drinks with friends. All of it would now face the ultimate test. Could I maintain the illusion I had built without him paying for it? And if not, what would happen when the fantasy collapsed? I didn't know then that within a few days, my carefully cultivated social media life, my so-called influencer persona, and the friendships that revolved around my aesthetic would all start unraveling. I would confront the most uncomfortable truth about myself, that I had built my identity on borrowed money, borrowed validation, and borrowed security. And Nathan, he would be there, not to punish me, not to lecture me, but simply to step back and let the consequences unfold. It was the beginning of the most brutal lesson of my life, and the start of discovering who I truly was when no one else was paying for my performance. I was 28, working part-time at a boutique downtown, the kind of place with soft lighting, delicate jewelry, and a wall of oversized mirrors that made you look like you were always in a photo shoot. I loved the aesthetic, the colors, the feel of the fabric between my fingers. But my paycheck barely covered rent and bills, let alone the lifestyle I dreamed about. That's where Nathan came in. Nathan was 31, a software engineer in Denver with a salary that made life easier in ways I had only imagined. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party 14 months ago. He was polite, charming, and laughed at all the right moments. From the start, I felt a magnetic pull, not just attraction, but a sense that he could understand me, even when I didn't fully understand myself. The first months were exhilarating. Nathan took me out to dinners I couldn't have imagined, often insisting I pick the fanciest spots. We explored new neighborhoods, tried quirky coffee shops, and went on spontaneous weekend trips. I loved documenting our outings, capturing the perfect light for Instagram, thinking I was building memories. But in reality, I was also building an image, one that relied heavily on Nathan's willingness to cover expenses. Our apartment became a canvas for my lifestyle influencer dreams. Every weekend, I planned outfits meticulously, arranging my ring light, tripod, and phone to create content. I tried to maintain a persona of effortless charm and style. Nathan often joked about my obsession with aesthetics, but he indulged me, paying for dinners, Ubers, even props for shoots. I thought he was just being supportive. Looking back, there were small signs I missed. Nathan sometimes seemed distant when I posted about spending, a faint tension when I suggested, maybe I need this new dress, or we should do another content shoot this weekend. Friends would mention how generous he was, but I interpreted it as him being in love with me. And to some extent, he was. He loved me, but love didn't mean he would enable delusions forever. Family interactions were another subtle minefield. Nathan's parents were polite but observant, never shy about asking practical questions or expressing concern about my spending habits. At first, I laughed it off, confident in my charm, convinced I could maintain appearances. I wanted them to see me as sophisticated, stylish, capable, even if reality was messier. Our dynamic was clear. I provided energy, creativity, and the social media content that reflected a seemingly perfect life. Nathan provided stability, financial support, and quiet tolerance. In hindsight, the imbalance was unsustainable, but at the time, it felt natural. I was building a persona of success while being cushioned by his generosity. Those months of bliss were intense but misleading. I loved Nathan, or at least the version of him I thought existed. Patient, indulgent, unwavering in his support. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Every extravagant brunch, every Uber ride, every photo shoot pushed the boundaries of generosity I hadn't fully acknowledged. And I didn't notice the subtle warning signs, his carefully measured words, the slightly tighter jaw when bills piled up, the unspoken limits I was about to test. By the time I realized the truth, I had already woven my identity into the fantasy of this lifestyle. And Nathan, patient as he was, had reached the point where he could no longer silently fund the illusion. That quiet tension would soon erupt, changing everything I thought I knew about love, boundaries, and responsibility. At first, the cracks were subtle, almost imperceptible. Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. But there was a new tension in the air. The way he glanced at receipts I left on the counter, the way he paused mid-sentence when I mentioned another purchase for a photo shoot. It was as if a weight had settled over us, invisible but tangible. It started with small comments, almost casual, yet loaded with meaning. "Do we really need 3 new outfits for the weekend shoot?" he asked one evening, trying to keep his tone neutral. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "Nathan, you don't get it. It's for engagement, for the followers. It's part of my brand." He didn't push further, but I caught the subtle tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the table. Friends began to notice too. I remember one brunch with my best friend, Lily, where Nathan's unease was obvious. She whispered to me, "Do you think he's annoyed about your spending?" I laughed it off, more out of habit than certainty. Nathan was quiet throughout the meal, his eyes flicking over his phone, checking notifications, sipping coffee slowly. There was a distant edge to him, a tension I had failed to read properly. Family interactions added another layer of pressure. Nathan's parents visited one Saturday, casual but observant. I had meticulously planned my outfit, my makeup, even the brunch I prepared, thinking everything was perfect. But over croissants and coffee, his mother remarked casually, "Olivia, it's wonderful you're so stylish, but do you ever worry about budgeting for the future?" Nathan's father nodded silently. I smiled, trying to mask the irritation, but inside I felt a prickling heat of defensiveness. Budgeting? My creativity wasn't something that could be measured in numbers. I wanted them to admire me, not lecture me. These small moments accumulated, like invisible sparks along a dry forest floor. Every glance, every comment, every raised eyebrow was fuel. Nathan began leaving subtle reminders about our finances, slips of paper with monthly totals, gentle suggestions about saving, and sometimes a quiet stare that made me uncomfortable. I wanted to push back, to assert that I knew what I was doing, that my content strategy and lifestyle were valid, but there was also that gnawing sense that perhaps I was pushing him too far. I remember sitting on the couch one evening, scrolling through Instagram, the faint glow of my ring light illuminating my face. Nathan was at the kitchen table, calculating something silently. I glanced over. "Are you angry?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of fear. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I'm just concerned." Concerned. The word felt like ice sliding down my spine. Concern wasn't a critique, it wasn't a fight, but it was the first clear sign that the dynamic I had taken for granted was shifting. Even minor disagreements turned into tense exchanges. I felt my pulse quicken whenever I mentioned another outfit, another content idea, or another brunch for Instagram. Nathan's calm had a new edge, his patience stretched thin, and I started noticing the emotional distance growing between us. Those early warning signs, the hesitations, the subtle disapprovals, the awkward silences, were seeds of conflict. At the time, I rationalized them away as minor friction, but deep down, I felt the pressure building. Something was about to break, and I had no idea just how forceful the impact would be. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary weekday that somehow becomes unforgettable. I had spent the morning prepping for a content shoot, coordinating outfits, lighting, and camera angles, while Nathan quietly worked at his laptop. We exchanged small talk, but there was a weight in the air neither of us acknowledged. That evening, I suggested we go out for dinner, something casual, nothing extravagant. Nathan agreed, but as soon as we arrived, his demeanor shifted. The conversation, light and playful just moments before, took on a subtle edge. He was quiet, responding in clipped sentences, and I sensed the tension building. After we got home, I decided to finally bring up what had been gnawing at me for weeks. "Nathan, we need to talk about money," I began cautiously, trying to keep my tone calm. He didn't look up, typing furiously. "About what?" he asked. There was no anger in his voice, just a precise, measured distance that made my stomach twist. "I've been thinking. Maybe I've been relying on you too much for content, for lifestyle, for everything," I said. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands fidgeting with my phone. "I want to contribute more, pay for some things myself, maybe save a bit, you know?" He stopped typing and looked at me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, he said flatly, "Olivia, stop trying to fix me. This is who you are. You either accept it or you don't." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I blinked, trying to process them. What do you mean?" My voice trembled slightly, disbelief coating every syllable. "I accept it," he said again, this time leaning back, calm, steady. "I accept that this is how you live. I'm done paying for everything. You want to maintain your lifestyle, your brand, your persona? Fine, but I will no longer fund it." My head spun, my chest tightened. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as if reality itself had contracted around me. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream, but all I could do was stare. Nathan wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter. He was simply stating a fact, a boundary that would irrevocably alter everything. I don't understand," I whispered, voice barely audible. The thought of losing the financial support that had underpinned my entire life felt surreal. How could he just stop? My whole world, built around the illusion of freedom, style, and influence, had been propped up by his generosity. And now, without a word of negotiation, it was gone. Nathan's calm stare made me feel small and exposed. "I accept it," he repeated. "And now you can, too. Accept that this is who you are. The rest is on you." I felt a shiver run down my spine. My hands trembled, gripping the edge of the couch. I wanted to argue, to plead, to negotiate, but I knew it was pointless. The man I loved, trusted, and relied on had drawn a line, and it was unmovable. That night, I lay in bed, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I truly considered the consequences of my choices. Every brunch, every Uber, every outfit meticulously curated for Instagram. They were no longer innocuous indulgences. They were decisions that now rested entirely on me, and I had no idea if I could survive the fallout. By the next morning, Nathan had quietly removed me as an authorized user on his credit card, changed passwords, and moved emergency funds. I didn't know yet. I just woke up to the realization that nothing would be the same. My social media, my friends, my brand, everything was about to collide with reality. And at that moment, in the quiet, terrifying dawn, I understood. This was no longer just a money issue. This was a reckoning. The illusion I had built for myself was about to shatter, and there was no one left to catch me. I didn't yet know if I would survive it, or if I even wanted to. The first morning after Nathan drew his line, I felt a strange mix of panic and disbelief. The apartment was quiet, but the air seemed heavier, thick with unspoken consequences. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, scrolling through Instagram stories, trying to convince myself that this was just a test, that he'd come around. But deep down, I knew. I had been exposed. The reality of my situation hit me like cold water. My carefully curated image, my followers, my perfect life had all been propped up by someone else's money. Every Uber ride, brunch, outfit, and lighting prop, the illusion was crumbling. And for the first time, I had to face the uncomfortable truth. I couldn't afford my life, not the one I wanted to showcase online, not the one I had promised myself I could live. I felt my chest tighten, pulse racing. My fingers shook as I texted Lily, trying to frame it lightly. "Hey, maybe I need to rethink my weekend shoots. Her reply was immediate, but neutral. Is Nathan being difficult again? That word, difficult, made me flinch. Was I being difficult, or was I just exposed? The first day without Nathan covering anything was surreal. I tried to pay for a small coffee, a lunch, my card declined, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just money, it was the validation, the feeling of being able to perform my identity, my persona, my brand, and suddenly it wasn't there. I realized I had never truly been independent. Every post, every story, every photo had relied on his support. When Nathan came home that evening, the tension was palpable. He didn't scold me. He didn't lecture. He simply asked calmly, "Did you survive today?" His eyes were steady, even kind, but the message was clear. The responsibility was mine now. I felt a surge of anger, humiliation, and shame all at once. I wanted to lash out. "You're ruining everything for me," I almost shouted, but the words caught in my throat. It wasn't Nathan's fault. I had built this life, these expectations, and now I had to face the consequences. My identity, my social image, the illusion I had crafted meticulously, it was all being dismantled, piece by piece. Late that night, lying in bed, I replayed every past moment with a new lens. Every lavish brunch Nathan had paid for, every Uber ride, every prop, every carefully staged photo. It all felt like a lie, a carefully maintained performance. I had traded reality for a fantasy and believed it was normal, even deserved. A sinking feeling gnawed at me. Had I ever truly been responsible? Had I ever really been honest with myself about what I could and couldn't handle? I realized I had been avoiding questions about budgeting, about saving, about practical choices, and now they were unavoidable. I also started analyzing Nathan, not with anger, but with clarity. He hadn't been cruel. He had been patient, silent, letting me continue until the pattern became impossible to ignore. His calmness wasn't indifference. It was a mirror, reflecting my own delusions back at me. And it hurt, because the mirror showed someone I barely recognized. By the third day, I felt a strange duality, panic at the loss of support and relief at the sudden clarity. I could no longer hide behind Nathan's generosity, and while that terrified me, it also forced me to confront my own flaws. For the first time, I felt the faint glimmer of agency, not as an influencer, not as a curated persona, but as Olivia, a person capable of real choices, however uncomfortable. The realization hit me harder than any argument ever could. I was entirely responsible for my life, and if I failed, it would be mine alone. The illusion was gone. The fantasy, the borrowed security, the carefully staged happiness, they were all gone. And in that quiet, painful moment, I understood that this was more than money. This was the reckoning for every time I had avoided responsibility, every time I had relied on someone else to maintain an illusion I couldn't afford. And Nathan, patient, calm, steady, was watching me finally confront it. For the first time, I truly understood the depth of the challenge ahead. It wasn't about arguing, manipulating, or persuading him anymore. It was about surviving myself. The days that followed were a relentless exercise in reality. Nathan's quiet boundary had triggered a domino effect I wasn't prepared for. At first, it was small things: missed Uber rides, skipped brunches, awkward social media posts that lacked the polish I had meticulously crafted. Then came the panic. My friends, accustomed to the lavish lifestyle I projected, began noticing that I wasn't always covering my own expenses anymore. Friday night, for example, we planned to go to a trendy rooftop bar downtown. Usually, Nathan would slide his card across the table, a silent affirmation of my performance-driven persona. That night, I approached the table, a cocktail menu in hand, only to find him leaning back, calm, detached. "You told me this is who you are," he said simply. "I'm letting you be who you are." The moment the check arrived, a cold wave of panic crashed over me. My carefully maintained image was vulnerable now, exposed in front of everyone. I fumbled through my bag, realized I had no backup. Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't intervene. For the first time, I was fully accountable for the lifestyle I had taken for granted. I had to call friends for Venmo contributions. 3 calls, 3 desperate pleas, each friend's hesitation, Each awkward transfer chipped away at my confidence. My social persona was intact for the camera, but behind the scenes, I was unraveling. My followers didn't see panic. They saw filtered perfection, but I could feel the real consequences pressing in. By Sunday, the reality had worsened. My usual content shoot, a brunch at my favorite spot, complete with ring light, tripod, and 30 photos, was compromised. I got dressed, prepared my setup, and rehearsed my cheerful demeanor for Instagram, only to realize I couldn't pay for the meal. Standing outside the cafe, it hit me. I couldn't even maintain the performance of my carefully curated life. I sat there for a moment, paralyzed. Then I left. I returned home with only coffee, my pride bruised, my followers none the wiser. As the week progressed, Nathan's quiet distance became a powerful force. He didn't nag. He didn't scold. He simply reinforced boundaries that highlighted my inability to sustain myself. My friends, initially sympathetic, started to pull away. Invitations became sparse. Even those who reached out seemed hesitant, unsure if I could contribute. The social scaffolding I had relied on was eroding. My desperation grew, and with it, I began to bend rules I had previously adhered to. Small things first. Borrowing from friends without clear repayment plans, charging minor expenses on credit cards I didn't have legal authority to use. Each act was justified in my mind. I need content for engagement, for my brand, for my identity. But beneath it, the reality was stark. I was scrambling to maintain an illusion, and every choice tightened the noose around me. Then came the weekend disaster. I planned a girls' night at our apartment, a so-called intimate hosted event I could document for Instagram. I coordinated snacks, drinks, music playlists, even a small cheese board, all while Nathan quietly moved my personal food into a locked office and left a note. I'm spending the evening at my buddy's. Enjoy your night. I arrived expecting applause, excitement, maybe even subtle admiration for my hosting skills. Instead, my friends wandered through the apartment confused, unsure where the food or alcohol was. Panic surged. I tried texting Nathan. Nothing. I sent frantic messages to friends, begging for assistance, but there was little they could do. The tension, once invisible, became palpable. Within an hour, the gathering unraveled. Guests left, murmuring confusion and mild disappointment. I was left with the remnants, half-empty glasses, scattered plates, and the cold realization that my ability to stage appearances without Nathan's support had collapsed entirely. I sat on the floor, tears streaming, mascara smudged, my mind racing. Nathan returned later, not with judgment or scolding, but with a calm observation. "You said this is who you are. Now you're living it." His words weren't cruel, they were undeniable. I realized then that my reliance on him had been a safety net for my delusions. Without it, the fragility of my life became impossible to ignore. For the first time, I understood the depth of my own enabling behavior. I had been teaching myself to live beyond my means, to rely on someone else's generosity, to construct a life built on borrowed funds and performative content. Nathan's patient detachment forced me to confront that reality head-on. The escalation didn't stop there. By midweek, I discovered that continuing my content required clever improvisation, striking deals with businesses for exposure instead of payment, using sample trays at coffee shops, exploiting friendly baristas, even returning items for store credit to fund necessities. I was surviving, barely, but every day felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and it would all collapse. And through it all, Nathan remained steady. He didn't intervene. He didn't lecture. He simply allowed me to experience the natural consequences of my choices, forcing me to confront the illusions I had built and the reality I had avoided. By the end of the week, I was exhausted, humiliated, and terrified. I had started the week imagining that I could maintain the persona of perfection without him. Now I realized I had been surviving on borrowed life, borrowed money, borrowed admiration, and it was all slipping through my fingers. By the time Sunday rolled around, I had reached a point I never thought possible. My carefully constructed life, the identity I had spent years curating online, had begun to crumble completely. My apartment, once a stage for Instagram photos and curated posts, now felt like a cage, each corner whispering reminders of my failures. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at my phone, scrolling past my own posts, the filtered perfection, the happy smiles, the vibrant scenes, and it all felt like a cruel joke. The truth was unavoidable. I had no money, no backup, and no safety net. Nathan wasn't the enemy, he was the catalyst. He had simply stepped back and allowed reality to take hold, and reality was terrifying. Every friend I had leaned on for support now seemed hesitant, distant. Invitations dried up. Messages went unanswered. Even Lily, my closest confidant, was careful not to enable my spiral. I was utterly alone, facing the consequences of my choices. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy online. I forced smiles for posts, staged content that hinted at vibrancy and control. But behind the camera, I felt hollow. The panic I had initially suppressed surged into every fiber of my being. My hands shook, my stomach churned, my chest felt heavy with anxiety. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep. Nights were spent lying awake, heart racing, staring at the ceiling, imagining worst-case scenarios. The girls' night disaster replayed in my mind constantly. I could see my friends' confused faces, the empty apartment, the abandoned snacks, the silence that had replaced laughter. I felt shame radiate from every pore, each memory a mirror reflecting my inadequacy. I realized then that I had been living not a life, but a performance funded entirely by someone else's generosity, and now the curtain had fallen. I tried calling Nathan, desperately seeking reassurance or guidance, but he remained calm, unflinching. "You asked for this," he said once, in his quiet, steady voice. "You wanted to be independent. Now you are." The words should have comforted me, but instead they sank into me like ice water. I wanted comfort, not a reminder. I wanted sympathy, not boundaries. I wanted the world to pause and let me catch up. But the world didn't care, and neither did Nathan. By midweek, I found myself crying in my room, mascara streaking my face, trembling hands gripping the edges of my dresser. I couldn't bring myself to look at social media. Even the thought of posting something curated felt impossible. I had become a ghost in my own life, haunted by the consequences of every indulgence, every reckless decision, every borrowed dollar. My phone buzzed with notifications, friends inviting me to events I couldn't afford, messages from businesses I had promised content to, but hadn't been able to deliver, DMs from followers asking for recommendations, shoutouts, collaborations. Each ping felt like a needle in my chest. I realized with crushing clarity that I had trapped myself in a life that no longer existed. My identity, my image, my so-called brand, all were built on sand, and the tide had come in. I tried to analyze what had gone wrong. I remembered every extravagant brunch, every designer outfit, every late-night Uber. Each memory was a lesson in my own denial, a reflection of my dependence on Nathan's support. I had believed I was living authentically, but in truth, I had been living in a meticulously crafted illusion, a fantasy sustained by someone else's money and patience. Sitting there, trembling, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of it. Fear, shame, humiliation, panic, grief. They collided inside me, creating a storm I couldn't escape. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I had been utterly, completely unprepared for adulthood, that I had built my life around appearances rather than reality. And now there was no escaping the consequences. That night, I didn't cry for the money I had lost. I didn't cry for the followers, the content, or the lifestyle I could no longer afford. I cried for myself, for the person I had become, the illusions I had clung to, the independence I had never truly had. For the first time, I felt the loneliness of accountability, the cold sting of reality. By the early hours of Monday, exhaustion overtook panic. I lay on the floor, curled up, staring at the ceiling, heart still racing. The weight of my actions, the consequences of my choices, and the realization of how far I had fallen pressed down on me like a physical force. I had reached the absolute bottom, the point where there was nothing left but raw, unfiltered truth. And in that darkness, I realized something crucial. Hitting rock bottom wasn't just terrifying, it was necessary. If I wanted to survive, to rebuild, to reclaim even a fragment of the life I had lost, I had to confront myself fully. The fantasy was gone. The illusions were shattered, and the only way forward was to face reality, no matter how painful, no matter how humiliating. It was the loneliest, most terrifying moment of my life, but also the moment that marked the beginning of true change. The turning point didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first light of dawn sneaking through the blinds. After days of panic, humiliation, and sleepless nights, I began noticing the cracks in my own reasoning, the patterns of my dependence, and the consequences of my choices. The realization was slow, but it hit me harder than any argument Nathan could have mustered. It started with a small moment of clarity. I was scrolling through Instagram, trying to maintain some semblance of my online persona when I paused on a post from a former collaborator. She had started a small, self-funded project, a local pop-up shop, without relying on anyone else. Her posts were modest, her reach limited, but they radiated authenticity. She was proud, independent, and accountable for every dollar, every decision, every outcome. And yet, she was thriving in a way I had never known. I felt a jolt. That could have been me. It should have been me. I had spent months, maybe years, performing a life I couldn't sustain, building a brand on borrowed resources and external validation. And here was someone, working quietly, authentically, taking responsibility for her own growth. The comparison stung, but it also ignited something inside me. That evening, I sat down with Nathan. I had rehearsed this conversation endlessly in my mind, fearing his judgment, fearing his disappointment. But when I looked at him, I realized I didn't need permission or approval. I needed honesty with myself. "Nathan," I began, my voice shaky but determined. "I think I finally understood. I've been living a life that wasn't mine. I relied on you, on borrowed money, on appearances, and I see now that I need to rebuild from the ground up. I need to take responsibility for my choices, my actions, my life." He listened quietly, his eyes steady, and nodded once. "It's about time," he said simply, without malice, without judgment. "You've been given a reality check. Now it's up to you what you do with it." That conversation, brief as it was, became the catalyst for real change. I started with small steps, mundane but essential. I created a strict budget, listing every necessary expense: rent, groceries, utilities, transportation. I calculated exactly what I could afford and what I couldn't. I deleted credit cards I had misused, closed accounts that had enabled my behavior, and set up automatic alerts for every transaction. Then came the hard part: content. My Instagram had always been my identity, my currency, my validation. Now it became a challenge. I started posting authentic updates, small victories, rather than staged perfection. A homemade meal I had actually paid for, a thrifted outfit, a coffee from a local cafe I could afford. Engagement dropped sharply. Followers, used to curated perfection, slowly unfollowed. But I didn't care. For the first time, my content reflected me, not the fantasy. Next, I sought income independence. I found a part-time job at a local boutique, modest but sufficient to cover some of my expenses. I signed up for freelance gigs that aligned with my skills, not my image. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to piece together a life that was sustainable, accountable, and real. Nathan observed quietly, stepping in only when absolutely necessary. He didn't bail me out, didn't fund my content, didn't shield me from consequences. Yet, there was a subtle shift in our relationship. The tension eased, replaced by a mutual respect. I wasn't relying on him anymore, and for the first time, he could see me. Not the persona, not the influencer, but Olivia, making her own choices, facing reality head on. The most striking moment came one evening, while balancing my budget and tallying expenses. I realized that, for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't panicking. I wasn't chasing illusions. I wasn't desperate for validation or funding. I had autonomy, I had agency, I had responsibility, and with it came an unexpected, powerful sense of relief. It was a turning point not because of drama, confrontation, or spectacle, but because I had finally confronted myself. I had faced my failures, my dependencies, my delusions, and chosen to change. The life I had once thought indispensable, lavish brunches, curated content, constant validation, wasn't worth sacrificing my dignity, independence, and mental health. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. I would never let someone else fund my fantasy at the cost of my reality again. I would rebuild authentically, deliberately, honestly, and I would do it entirely on my own terms. The days following my turning point were a mixture of liberation and chaos, as the consequences of past actions continued to ripple outward. I had committed myself to responsibility, but the world didn't pause to accommodate my awakening. Instead, I watched as the fallout from my previous life, built on borrowed money, borrowed attention, and borrowed admiration, finally caught up with me. First came my social circle. Friends who had once praised my lifestyle and aesthetic, who had envied the seemingly endless supply of brunches, outfits, and curated experiences, began to distance themselves. Some unfollowed on Instagram. Others quietly ceased invitations to events. Those who remained were cautious, watching to see whether I would falter or finally sustain myself without Nathan's support. The social scaffolding I had leaned on for years was gone, and the absence was stark. The boutique where I had previously freelanced and collaborated for content updates now required punctuality, accountability, and real work, not staged posts or performance-driven photos. I had to show up on time, assist with inventory, manage customers, and handle tasks without the safety net of borrowed funds or inflated online status. It was humbling. My followers never saw these behind-the-scenes efforts, but I felt a growing sense of pride with each small success. At home, Nathan maintained his quiet stance. He had stepped back completely, allowing the lessons to sink in. No longer was there the constant financial cushion, the silent enabler behind every purchase, every content shoot, every meal out. His patience had turned into one of the most powerful forces shaping my growth. I began to see the depth of his wisdom. He hadn't controlled me. He had simply refused to fund my delusions. Then came the ultimate test. My landlord and financial reality. I had delayed rent in the past months, relying on Nathan's coverage for essentials. Now, with our autonomy, I had to ensure my own housing security. I scheduled meetings, calculated my budget meticulously, and secured income to cover the next month's rent. Each payment made without intervention reinforced my independence, a stark contrast to the previous months of reliance. The lessons extended beyond money. I realized how much of my online persona, my curated content, my engagement metrics, my so-called influence, was a reflection of my dependence on others. Nathan's departure from my enabling cycle revealed that the admiration I had sought it was never truly earned. It was borrowed from resources and generosity that weren't mine to begin with. Confronting this truth was humbling but necessary. I also noticed how Nathan's family had reacted throughout the process. Initially, his calm support had angered and frustrated me. I had expected judgment, criticism, perhaps even lectures, but he had allowed reality to unfold naturally. His family, who had once been a subtle source of pressure and expectation, had witnessed the consequences of enabling a lifestyle built on illusions. Slowly, their attitudes shifted. They respected boundaries, recognized autonomy, and appreciated accountability. It was clear to me that respect had to be earned, not assumed, and that every choice carried weight. The biggest personal revelation came when I finally reflected on my relationships with other people. I had relied on friends, strangers, and business partners to maintain a performance-driven identity, but without authentic contribution, the connections were hollow. Now, as I paid for my own groceries, managed my own responsibilities, and crafted a sustainable content plan, I saw who stayed, who supported me, and who was simply attached to the fantasy. It was painful, yes, but also clarifying. I could invest in people who valued authenticity rather than performance. Even online, the fallout was visible. My follower count dropped. Comments that once praised lavish experiences dwindled. Engagement metrics, once a source of validation, became irrelevant. I began posting stories that documented genuine moments, an affordable coffee, a thrifted outfit, a walk in the park, not for likes, but to remind myself that life was more than metrics. Slowly, a new form of content emerged, one rooted in authenticity, creativity, and self-reliance. Nathan's quiet influence persisted. He didn't celebrate my failures, nor did he revel in my growth. Instead, he offered occasional encouragement, a nod of acknowledgement when I managed a task or handled a challenge independently. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it reinforced an essential lesson. Growth is internal, not performative. By the end of this phase, I had transformed the chaos into structure. I had repaid small debts, recalibrated my relationships, and redefined my sense of self-worth. The fallout from my previous behavior, the embarrassment, the social distance, the isolation, was harsh, but it was a necessary catalyst. I had survived the consequences of my choices and, in doing so, discovered resilience I hadn't known existed. Through this process, I realized something profound. The destruction of the fantasy wasn't punishment, it was liberation. I was no longer trapped in an unsustainable performance. I was accountable, independent, and authentic. And while the world might have judged, abandoned, or distanced itself from me, I had finally reclaimed control over my life. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a new life. I no longer woke up in panic, chasing illusions, or waiting for validation. Instead, I woke up with purpose. Each morning, I reviewed my budget, planned my day, and made small but meaningful decisions that shaped my reality. Gone were the extravagant brunches, the staged photos, the borrowed money. In their place was independence, accountability, and clarity. Nathan and I reached a new understanding. Our relationship had survived not through conflict or compromise, but through boundaries. He wasn't my financial safety net anymore, and I wasn't the person who relied on him to fuel a fantasy. We could enjoy each other's company without enabling each other's illusions. I could see him for who he truly was, a partner who respected honesty, accountability, and real effort. The lessons went beyond money. I learned that identity isn't constructed through appearances or the approval of others. It's forged through action, responsibility, and authenticity. I had spent years performing a life that wasn't mine, only to discover that reality, though harsh, was far more rewarding than illusion. I realized that true self-worth cannot be borrowed. Borrowed admiration cannot sustain happiness, and external validation is meaningless without inner accountability. My social media transformed alongside me. Instead of curated perfection, I shared real moments, a thrifted outfit that I actually owned, a home-cooked meal, or a small victory at work. The follower count dropped, but the engagement that remained was genuine. The people who stayed weren't there for fantasy, they were there for connection. And that, more than anything, felt real. I also found balance in relationships. I began spending time with friends who valued authenticity over performance, who celebrated effort over illusion. Conversations became deeper, laughter became easier, and I stopped measuring worth by how many likes a photo received. I had learned the power of boundaries, the importance of accountability, and the strength of self-reliance. Looking back, I understand now that Chloe's story, my own story, wasn't about money, social media, or appearances. It was about realizing who I truly was when all the props were stripped away. It was about confronting my delusions, accepting the consequences, and choosing to grow. Nathan's final words to me during this period stayed with me. You have to live your own life. Nobody else can do it for you. I finally understood. Independence isn't just financial. It's emotional, mental, and moral. I no longer needed someone to fund my identity, validate my choices, or perform my reality. I had everything I needed within myself. As I close this chapter, I feel a quiet sense of triumph. The illusion is gone, but the lessons remain. I have rebuilt my life, my self-worth, and my identity, authentically and independently. And the most important truth I can share with anyone watching, anyone following along, is this. Loving someone doesn't mean funding their delusions. Real growth comes from accountability, self-awareness, and courage. Sometimes you have to let people and yourself face reality. Only then do you discover who you truly are and who is truly worth your time, your effort, and your life.